Well, Max, shall we get started? I'll just quickly introduce you. I think probably everybody's seen the blurbs and the emails and the tweets and so on. But Max is the author of Art Against Art After Money, Money After Art, and Revenge Capitalism, which he gave a talk here at the MEP on a year or two ago. He teaches at Lakehead University in Canada and co-directs the Reimagining Value Action Lab, which maybe you could tell us a little about later. And Max, of course, is the author of Palm Oil, The Grease of Empire, which he is about to talk about. So,
Yay!
over to Max.
Thank you. Let me just share this. Can you see that?
Yes.
Let me actually, just one second. I'm just going to reshare it to make sure that we've got the sound, because there's a little video in it. Okay. Yes, we have sound. Okay, very good. Well, thanks so much, Fred, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'm glad to be here to talk to you about this work. I started on this book about 10 years ago, and it had a bit of a strange origin, which is that I was hired to teach anti-capitalism to art students, essentially, at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, which is one of Canada's best-known art schools, and one particularly well-known for its fairly worldly curriculum and its political orientation. And I made the case to them that artists, if they were to be effective in this moment, needed somehow to have an analysis of capitalism, and they hired me. And as I began teaching my courses there, I found myself in need of a story I could tell these students that would somehow encompass the history of capitalism, but also touch on their interests, which included things like art history and artistic materials and the politics of representation and questions of race and colonialism and questions of globalization. And through a roundabout way, I ended up striking on the topic of palm oil. It wasn't just that palm oil is something that the students encountered every day in a multitude of products, from personal cleaning projects and hygiene products like soap and makeup and detergents, which are many of them are mostly made up of palm oil, but also a huge number of foodstuffs. Arguably, some 50% of products in any supermarket are made of or contain palm oil in some way, shape, or form. This includes many sort of convenience foods, including famously spreads like Nutella or certain forms of peanut butter, but also granola bars, candies, snacks, fried foods, as we'll learn in a moment, ramen noodles, and a whole variety of other commodities. So it was a great object to teach with, a great commodity to teach with, because it was very intimate and familiar to the students, even though they'd never seen, like me, had never seen a palm tree, oil palm tree at least, and never seen a palm oil plantation. There were other links as well. I discovered an interesting story, which I begin the book with, of the seizure by the British Empire of the so-called Benin bronzes. These were a set of ivory and brass and other sculptures that were seized in the 1898 punitive expedition that the British led against the inland kingdom of the Edo Kingdom in what's now Nigeria, seizing these incredibly precious and quite phenomenal artifacts. And that gave me a way to talk to the students about art, about quite famous art objects, the way that art objects change their form when they enter Western museums to become sort of trophies of imperialism. And then, as I discovered, there were many other links as well that could be made throughout the term. So ultimately, my engagement with palm oil began in the classroom. And I think that's continued on to this book. It's a teaching book. It's a book for learning about the world we live in together. Unlike most of my other books, as a sort of cultural theorist, it's not necessarily primarily sort of striving to advance a theorization of palm oil. I'm certainly no expert on palm oil when it comes to colleagues in the fields like history, anthropology, geography, food studies. I'm rather something of a tourist in the area. My real interest in writing this book was asking, what might a kind of anti-capitalist storytelling look like now? And it was an attempt to challenge myself to move away from simply explicating ideas and propagating ideas, and to trying to craft something a little more artistic and a little more aesthetic. Even though the book is a nonfiction book, I wanted to challenge myself on the topic of form on some level. The reason I thought that was important is because I was, as someone who had been following the palm oil story for some years before I started writing the book, dissatisfied with the dominant stories of palm oil and the dominant stories trying to challenge palm oil. And I think that story is most beautifully and best emblematized by a very phenomenal video prepared by Greenpeace some years ago, which I'm going to show you now. In it, they commissioned sort of A-list actors, incredible animators, great sound design, in order to tell a story that can really be understood by a 5-year-old about palm oil and its problems in the world. But as I'll detail after we watch it, it's just a couple of minutes long, I think there's some problems with the way they're presenting the story. I think their campaign is important, and I'm glad they're doing the work they're doing. But I think from a more in-depth anti-capitalist analysis, it's lacking a lot of things, both in terms of the story it tells and the politics it espouses. Let's take a look.
There's a orangutan in my bedroom and I don't know what to do. She plays with all my teddies and keeps borrowing my shoe. She destroys all of my houseplants and she keeps on shouting, ooh. She throws away my chocolate and she howls at my shampoo. There's a orangutan in my bedroom and I don't want her to stay. So I told the naughty orangutan that she had to go away. Orangutan in my bedroom, just before you go, why were you in my bedroom? I really want to know. There's a human in my forest and I don't know what to do. He destroys all of our trees for your food and your shampoo. There's a human in my forest and I don't know what to do. He took away my mother and I'm scared he'll take me too. There are humans in my forest and I don't know what to do. They're burning it for palm oil. So I thought I'd stay with you. Orangutan in my bedroom, now I do know what to do. I'll fight to save your home and I'll stop you feeling blue. I'll share your story far and wide so others can fight too. Orangutan in my bedroom, I swear it on the stars. The future's not yet written, but I'll make sure it is ours.
Very emotive and well-made advertisement for Greenpeace. I think it does a lot of things very well. It mobilizes the tropes and the techniques of Hollywood melodrama very effectively. It's appealing to a wide and diverse audience. You can basically watch it without sound and still get the entire meaning. My concern with it is that, of course, I mean, it's a very simple story, so it can't tell necessarily the complexities of a global system. But more than that, it participates, I think, in a form of storytelling about our global ecological crisis that places undue emphasis on the individual consumer in the global north. I mean, this isn't a story about people in the rainforest working with non or more than human others to resist the palm oil plantations. This is a story about a young girl who has a bedroom, presumably in a suburban or urban house somewhere in the global north, and who is a palm oil consumer. And as I will kind of show in this presentation, and I argue in the book, the narratives of consumer activism that we are often feel like we're left with are fundamentally limiting and I think quite dissatisfying in terms of actually helping us think through the problem that we're all in and our forms of global entanglement. To tell a different kind of story, I begin with, as I mentioned, the 1898 punitive expedition that the British led into the Kingdom of Benin, or the Edo Kingdom, in what's now Nigeria. And in addition to seizing what came to be known as the Benin bronzes, these statues and artifacts which made their way into museums around the world, the British were in fact most interested in securing that country's lucrative palm oil production capacities. The Edo kingdom was an empire that dominated other empires and other kingdoms and other communities in the region. And much of that empire's economy, as well as its religion and its society, was built around palm oil, which people in West Africa had been harvesting and refining and selectively breeding and planting for millennia. So the story I'm trying to tell about palm oil is not a condemnation of the thing in and of itself. It's rather of the ways in which this quite amazing plant and quite amazing substance derived from a plant becomes weaponized under capitalism to move away from its traditional uses within communities and its embedded uses within society and towards this kind of alienated commodity which is responsible for so much destruction around the world. The British invaded the Edo kingdom in order to get rid of one of their rivals in what we now know as Nigeria, in the wake of the Berlin Conference, where European powers gathered to split up Africa into their zones of influence and license one another to colonialism and imperialism. Why were the British so interested in palm oil at the time? Well, it wasn't because, as today, it was in 50% of supermarket products. In fact, the European appetite for palm oil was only to emerge after the Second World War, by and large. There were attempts to get people to eat it before that, but they were largely unsuccessful. Rather, palm oil at that time literally and figuratively greased the wheels of empire. Pictured here is the steamship that the British troops used to travel upriver to the Edo Kingdom for their invasion in 1898. The wheels and gears of that steamship would have likely been greased by palm oil, as would the gears of locomotives throughout the British Empire and throughout the other European empires as well. So too would many of the machines in the factories of the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Age. So quite literally, the importation of palm oil, almost all of which was grown until the 20th century in West Africa, was a crucial element in the development of capitalism in the late 19th century. Importantly, the market for palm oil was not sort of naturally derived. It was actually derived in the wake of the British Empire's abolition of the slave trade, and in the seeking of Liverpool, especially Liverpool merchants, for a new cargo from Africa to import, and ways to sustain the very lucrative relationships that English and other European elites had formed with African elites to extract both people and resources from the African interior. So palm oil, on the one hand, was this quintessential grease of empire, which explains why the British were so eager to get at it and to ensure that they had no competition to consistently drive down its price by more and more sort of violently exploiting the labor of African people. Palm oil was also used in a number of new commodities in the 19th century, which help us explain somehow how that figure of the consumer, and in fact the consumer activist, emerged and comes down to us from that time. This is an image of a canning factory in, I believe, Belgium. Europe at the time had figured out methods for the preservation of food with tin cans, and a big part of the process of adhering tin, much of it was mined in Malaysia, I should mention, to steel, was through a process that involved a palm oil flux. That's a kind of bath that allowed the two metals to bond together. So palm oil, even though people weren't necessarily eating it at this time in Europe, was essential to this new form of food. And this form of food was very important as empires began to expand around the earth. First of all, it allowed for tropical and exotic commodities, food commodities, including salmon from Canada or tea from China or others, to be sent back to empire in a way that preserved its freshness for consumption within the metropole. But more than that, it also allowed for European empires to send food along with its soldiers, for instance, like those who executed the invasion of Benin, that allowed them to avoid nutritional dependency on local populations. Because by the late 19th century, one form of resistance that colonized people or people resisting imperialism had found was poisoning. And empires were extremely worried that if they depended on local populations, they opened up their troops and officials to this form of anti-colonial revenge. At the same time, and by the late 19th century, Europeans were importing a lot of palm oil also to produce candles. At this time, the previous sources of candles, including animal fat and whale oil, were becoming less and less reliable. Animal fat was becoming increasingly expensive as meats became more expensive in certain ways and supply chains became disrupted. Whale oil was becoming more scarce as whaling fleets hunted many types of whales to near extinction. Palm oil arrived as an excellent means to make candles, especially for the working class who could not afford electrification or gaslight, and yet who still labored at home often and needed light to basically do a lot of work that occurred within homes. That was through systems that weren't necessarily factory labor, but labor that whole families would engage in the home. For instance, sewing or other textile aspects of textile manufacturing or more. So the candle became an essential technology for certain aspects of capitalist accumulation in the late 19th century. And interestingly, one of the things that began to happen was the association of candles and the buying of candles with certain form of consumer activism. You can see in the upper left-hand corner the crest of Price's distilled palm candles, in which there's an interesting scene going on. The figure on the left is an enslaved African, even though this was many years after the abolition of the slave trade. The enslaved African is being held by a rope by a white slave trader. And then there's a candle maker interceding in between them, who is offering the Phrygian cap of liberty to the enslaved man who's on his knees and holding a candle to the rope that is binding him. And the implication here is that by purchasing candles and supporting the palm oil candle industry, European consumers would be able to support the abolition of slavery. The idea here was that West Africa was a den of evil commercial practices. That true might include some unscrupulous European traders, but was also the responsibility of even more unscrupulous and barbaric African traders. And that the palm industry was one that would bring what John Stuart Mill somewhat ironically called gentle commerce to the darker nation, to the heart of darkness, so to speak. That the palm oil industry encouraged industriousness and hard work and a kind of bourgeois capitalist labor relation within Africa, as opposed to the forms of enslaved labor that Europeans imagined existed there. Now, of course, the reality was that the forms of labor exploitation that predominated in the palm oil industry, from which they derived the oil for the palm candles, was very much like slavery. And if it wasn't exactly like slavery, it was like slavery in all but name. The conditions were extremely exploitative, often subcontracted so that Europeans themselves weren't enforcing the exploitative labor relations. They were taking advantage of either ancestral or emerging power relations between different African groups or between different African classes. But nonetheless, like the slave trade that predated it, the trade in palm oil was a horrific one. So the claims that Europeans had any interest whatsoever in anything except the exploitation of Africans were completely bogus. And yet we should ask ourselves, why then a narrative such as the one that this advertising scheme presents was so compelling to European consumers? Another example of how the palm oil industry produced these kinds of narratives was soap. Here I'm drawing on imagery that is, very explicitly racist and has been analyzed quite brilliantly more than 20 years ago now by Anne McClintock in her fascinating book, Imperial Leather. The soap industry advanced by leaps and bounds, especially Lever, who would eventually become sort of the king of soap and the king of soap advertising. A brand that continues to this day under the brand name Unilever, which is one of the world's largest manufacturers of palm oil products still. At the time, the European consumer was promised that by purchasing soap, they could participate in the fruits of empire and also the mission of empire as well. The advertisement on the left demonstrates how the soap companies, whose products were mostly made of West African palm oil and later Southeast Asian palm oil, was able to mobilize racist ideas in order to conscript consumers within Europe from the middle class and then later the working class to sort of buy into a form of white supremacy that covered over class tensions. As McClintock points out, these advertisements were by and large targeting women to suggest that the role of a good housewife was not only to keep the family clean, to do the reproductive labor of cooking and cleaning and social reproduction in the home, it was also to preserve and uplift the race. There was here a high relationship between these ideas of personal hygiene and racial hygiene that were being propounded and echoed in these advertisements. And more generally, what they proposed was that both the working classes, the middle classes, and the ruling classes shared in the benefits of and the responsibility for the imperial project. Here on the right is an advertisement that was propounded in the United States that features the colonel on his way to, quote unquote, liberate the Philippines, speaking about how it was America's responsibility to take up the white man's burden, and that this required the white man to cleanse himself in the bathroom, as seen here, with this soap, but also, as you can see in the lower right-hand corner of that, and the lower left-hand corner of that advertisement, to bring soap to the darker races of the world, who are considered to be not only physically and sort of spiritually unclean, but also in need of Western tutelage around hygiene in order to potentially raise themselves up, or perhaps they were never intended to raise themselves up at all. They were intended to be kind of eternally under white domination and white tutelage. This gives us a sense of some of the origins of the narrative of consumer activism that I see still at work in advertisements like the one we saw with Greenpeace. It fundamentally delimits the imagination of the consumer to imagine that their scope of action in the world is limited towards philanthropic consumerism. Now, first of all, philanthropic consumerism doesn't and has never worked. It is a scam. It is a particularly capitalist scam, and it's particularly noxious because it preys on people's sympathies and solidarities. It promises them that they can, in fact, do something about the errors and horrors of the world simply by making different consumer decisions. But more than that and deeper, I think, the problem with the consumer activist narrative that I believe stretches back to the 19th century and the advertisements we've seen and continues to the present is it fundamentally distorts and skews the ways we might imagine our agency in the world, and in particular in a world that even since the 19th century has been deeply entangled, in the sense that Europeans already in the 19th century were relying on palm oil. They were increasingly dependent on people around the world for their sustenance. There was as Lisa Lau puts it, an intimacy of the continents. There was an intimacy that was hidden from view, where people were becoming increasingly interdependent on one another. And I think that has only expanded and extended itself in our current age, as we'll discuss in a moment when we come to the current dynamics of global palm oil. Before we get there, I also want to say that the weaponization of palm oil was not only a metaphor. This is the dynamite mixing in one of Alfred Nobel's early factories, where nitroglycerin was combined with clay to produce this explosive substance, which so revolutionized the world. I have every reason to believe that much of the glycerin that Nobel and other dynamite producers used was derived from palm oil, which at the time would have been one of the cheapest sources of fat that could be refined down into glycerin. It's very difficult to find proof positive that, in fact, his dynamite was made out of palm oil, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that certainly would have been an appealing choice. Now, the dynamite was not only highly destructive when it was used as a weapon of war, of course, and we'll come to that in a moment. It was also extremely destructive in the sense that it enabled a whole new wave of extraction and capitalist expansion around the world because it permitted those who were seeking to build railways, another infrastructure to make their way inland into conquered territory, could blast through rock faces and could level ground to ensure that the ease of transportation in and out of hinterlands. Dynamite was also widely used in mining to enable ever deeper and ever more expansive forms of extraction as well. The weaponization of palm oil continued into the 20th century, including the notorious weapon that bears its name, napalm, which was developed at a laboratory at Harvard University by combining incendiaries with palm oil to produce the particularly sticky substance, which was used to such devastating effect in theaters of combat like Vietnam, where the imperialist powers sought to destroy a popular counterinsurgency, not only by targeting combatants, but also by targeting civilians and by targeting the ecosystem. Specifically, these imperialist forces were targeting the relationship between insurgent forces, civilian populations, and ecosystems as these groups collaborated to try and fight off invasion. Napalm proved to be a singularly devastating and singularly horrific weapon in those fights because it's so indiscriminate. It destroys all three: combatants, civilians, and ecosystems. And so we arrive somehow at the present day, where now some 80 to 85% of all palm oil around the world is produced in Indonesia and Malaysia, two countries that were themselves the sites of incredibly violent anti-communist counterinsurgency in the late 20th century. And it's in the wake of those violent counterinsurgency campaigns that it became possible to establish the massive palm oil plantations that today dominate the landscape with such drastic consequences. This is also true of many countries in Latin America and South America, where similarly, decades of CIA and Western-funded counterinsurgency and state terrorism campaigns, often at the behest of agricultural or agribusiness companies, have not only devastated the landscape, but also led to what the palm oil industry really needs to produce its commodity so cheaply, which is dispossessed populations. In the first place, populations dispossessed of their lands can't defend their lands when they are transformed by local entrepreneurs or mafias into monoculture plantations. For another, dispossessed populations no longer have the means to sustain themselves by growing their own food and providing the necessities of life, and are increasingly reliant on capitalist markets, which is to say they're reliant on the wage relation. And so these increasingly migrant dispossessed labor forces have to turn to industries like the palm oil industry in order to find work. These populations are so fearful of losing their employment or of the forms of outright terrorism employed by these mafias or these local entrepreneurs way out in the hinterland where rainforests are being cut down to grow palm oil that they can rarely muster a defense or ally themselves with indigenous groups or traditional communities there to defend the forest when it's cut down. This has led to drastic and horrific environmental consequences as well, including precipitous drops in biodiversity as diverse forests are cut down to make way for monocultures, as well as the destruction of forests that the world desperately needs as carbon sink, something that's been made even worse because often the forests that are being cut down are on peatlands, which are very biodiverse and very fertile, in part because they sequester so much carbon in that sort of carbon-rich substrate. So essentially, what we have is a situation today where the palm oil industry represents really some of the worst aspects of what capitalism has to offer in terms of the manufacturing of the commodity itself. This map from the industry itself indicates how industrialized the palm oil production cycle is. It's quite remarkable what industrial chemists and the industry have been able to do to take this quite remarkable fruit and transform it into a vast multitude of different products. But the infographic here gives you a sense of how diverse those products are and how they find their way into commodities around the world. Over the last 30 years, the palm oil has responded to strenuous criticism of their activity by founding what is called the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, which is a collaboration between government bodies, major palm oil exporting corporations, palm oil importing corporations like, for instance, Unilever, and also certain NGOs, including the World Wildlife Fund. And the idea was to create a voluntary global regulatory body that would be able to certify that certain kinds of palm oil have been grown sustainably. This has been, I think it's fair to say, a huge failure of global proportions. It's not only that still to this day, only some 15% of palm oil produced around the world is actually certifiable as sustainable. It's also that the framework for what sustainability means has essentially been gamed or essentially manipulated by the most powerful people, including government bodies and in palm oil exporting countries and corporations, to be extremely lax. What's more, it's been proven time and again that the RSPO has very few enforcement mechanisms and that its investigations of complaints is incredibly cumbersome and incredibly slow, taking sometimes up to 10 or 12 years to come to an adjudicated response to claims of non-sustainability in the industry, and even then that response has proven itself to be largely toothless. So there's a huge problem in the industry that even despite claims to sustainability, these claims are nowhere near the truth to any, I think, reasonable notion of sustainability. Underneath that is another problem, though, and that problem revolves around the narrative of palm oil when it reaches the shores of non-palm oil producing countries, which is to say countries like Canada or the United States or countries of the European Union that are consumers of palm oil. That narrative, again, focuses on the consumer as the point of decision making, as the political lever that needs to be, or the political fulcrum that needs to be activated. This is often revolved around health concerns with palm oil. Palm oil is unique, or almost unique, among commercially available fats because of its very high concentration of saturated fat. In the years when it was revealed the terrible health consequences of trans fats from hydrogenated oils, many industries around the world turned to palm oil as a remarkable fat that stayed solid at what Europeans tend to imagine to be room temperature. This, however, has contributed to escalating rates of obesity in countries in the global north. But the ways in which we speak about obesity are fundamentally flawed as well, and similarly by the kinds of capitalist forces that I was trying to map in this book. Here we have a highly derogatory, fat-phobic depiction of the problem from 2004. Here you have, of course, this sort of smug Uncle Sam declaring that he, by which I suppose means the American people, and then more generally the wealthy nations of the global north, have a problem or a disease called obesity. And then you have some equally caricatured, racialized figures from the global south, seemingly in conditions of near starvation, wryly commenting that that is a disease they will never have to worry about. This is flawed for a great number of reasons. As we know, obesity is in fact highly indexed to poverty, not to wealth. Obesity is often the result of trauma. It's often the result of the fate of workers who rarely have time or wealth to prepare quality meals and buy the ingredients for quality meals. Obesity is mostly linked to the ways in which in the global north, we've established lifestyles that are highly alienating, that depend, for instance, on private transportation rather than public transportation, that revolve around cities that have been built for cars rather than for people. and in ways that have been essentially shaped by corporations who don't care anything about the health of individuals, who actually benefit from the ill health of individuals, and are seeking simply to make as much money as possible. This is also true in the global south, where in countries like India, the obesity epidemic is rising year by year, not because people are becoming wealthier, but in fact, exactly the opposite. People are increasingly dependent on cheap foods like palm oil and refined foods built on palm oil, because they are too poor to afford anything else, and because they've been deprived of their means of subsistence through the processes of capitalist extraction and alienation and exploitation that have, through what David Harvey has called accumulation by dispossession, displaced people from their land bases and severed people from the sort of metabolic relationship between humans and the rest of the earth. So there's a much deeper story here that gets mystified when we focus on the problem of obesity, as for instance has happened in a number of European countries where it has been proposed or even attempted to institute something like the Nutella tax that attempts to put a price on highly fatty fast foods. Similarly, in California, we've seen similar attempts around soft drinks as well. These are essentially means by which we pass down responsibility for systemic problems onto the shoulders of the individual consumer. And like the problems I've been pointing out with consumer activism throughout this talk, it's highly prejudicial against poor people, and it mystifies the actual causes of the problem, which is to say, a system built on profits from human misery. The example that I like to provide is of ramen noodles, because I think they're an example that we all encounter in most of our lives. We're very familiar with them. Ramen noodles were developed it's a modern food that was developed in Korea and Japan after the Second World War, when the United States essentially dumped huge amounts of wheat flour on those countries as part of nutritional aid. Which was a very strange thing to do in countries that had before that time largely relied on on rice and rice products. And as a result, culinary developments led to the ramen noodle, which today is mostly enriched wheat flour, MSG or salt, and palm oil. Ramen noodles have emerged as the food of the world's poor in many ways. This is a map that depicts the massive changes that happened over 25 years in China as that country emerged as the world's industrial superpower. 250 million people moved from China's rural hinterland to its coastal cities at that time. Incredibly poor people and in this moment, ramen noodles really arose as a massive global commodity to feed people who had extremely poor wages, extreme levels of exploitation in dormitories, often didn't have the facilities to cook for themselves, let alone the wealth to buy fresh food on the market. Ramen noodles essentially became iconic of that generation of Chinese migrant workers who, through metabolizing palm oil, which is to say by eating a product much of it made by palm oil, transformed the energy of the oil palm into energy for them to be able to manufacture the goods that now we find all around us. In fact, the energy that is metabolized by the oil palm from sunlight, transformed into palm oil bunches, refined into commercial grade palm oil, manufactured into ramen noodles, eaten by workers, is also the energy that has allowed for us to even communicate today, given that many of the components in the computers and digital devices that we're using are the products of that labor, are the products of that metabolism. Another example of ramen noodles is a phenomenon that came to widespread prominence in the last 5 to 10 years, where it was discovered that prisoners in Americans' gulags in the system of mass incarceration have been relying on ramen noodles to be a currency, replacing what many people had thought of was the traditional currency of prisons, the cigarette. The reason why prisoners or incarcerated people rely on ramen is not only because it's fungible and indifferent in the sense that every package of ramen noodle is pretty much like every other package of ramen noodles. It's also because it's fairly accessible within prisons in the sense that it can be bought from a prison commissary, though at a massive markup. A ramen noodle package that might cost us 10 cents at this corner store, or 50 cents at the corner store, might cost up to $5 at a prison commissary run by a for-profit corporation, even in a public prison. But more than that, prisoners have turned to ramen noodles because the food in American prisons is so horrifying and so inedible that many of them cannot ingest enough calories in a day to survive, let alone to thrive. And the reliable prepackaged ramen noodle presents a means by which they can survive within a system that is explicitly, intentionally, and unambiguously striving for what Ruth Gilmore Wilson calls their premature death. Which is to say, as Wilson puts out, Gilmore suggests, this is a system that she likens to one of human sacrifice. That somehow human sacrifice has moved from the margins of society to its center. That now we live in a capitalist system that is more than happy to place on the altar of accumulation whole populations who are now, within the logic of capitalism, rendered surplus. Surplus here, the idea of a surplus population, has a long history going back to Marx. I think it's a very important term for us to contend with as we try and make sense of what the sadly recently departed Mike Davis called a planet of the slums. Surplus populations are those that depend on capitalism, but for whom capitalism has no use. They depend on wages in order to buy the necessities of life because they've been severed from their land bases and their means of subsistence and reproduction. And yet, capitalism has no use for their labor. It isn't even worth exploiting them. And so surplus populations are either incarcerated, either in prisons or in open-air prisons that take the form of slums and other highly policed areas around the world. People are incarcerated increasingly in whole countries that are allowed to languish and to suffer so that we can maintain the wealth of a small minority. Increasingly, the world is divided into rich gated zones and incredibly poor areas of surplus populations, where people are increasingly dependent either on solidarity, if they're lucky, or on informal economies and organized crime, if they're unlucky. I think it's valuable to take up Gilmore's notion of an era of human sacrifice because it ties back to the beginning of our story. When the Europeans when the British invaded the Edo Kingdom for their palm oil production capacity, they didn't just come out and say that's what they were going for. They, of course, targeted that kingdom because they accused its leadership of committing barbarous acts of human sacrifice. And indeed, the elites of the Edo Kingdom, they weren't elites. It was a highly class stratified society. The vast majority of the people were exploited, and the elite did use human sacrifice, although historians are somewhat split on whether we should see it as human sacrifice or whether we should see it as a form of capital punishment, much like the United States practices today, or such as the British Empire practiced at the time of the invasion. The justification of invasion and destruction in the name of preventing human sacrifice, I think, is really important for us to dwell with. But so too is the fact that the British invasion of the Edo Kingdom, which destroyed that kingdom almost completely, was itself a form of human sacrifice. Those people and that culture was sacrificed on the altar of the British Empire, much as those people who are now in the American prison system, forced to rely on ramen noodles for their nutrition, are also the sacrificial victims of the American Empire, built as it is on these long histories of race and racism. So too are all of the workers within the palm oil industry, or all of those Chinese laborers who were displaced from their land to flood into cities to build the world that we now all inhabit. if we want to understand these new forms of entanglement and interdependency that we are all a part of, and that palm oil shows we're all a part of, because it's literally in all of us, it's around all of us all the time, then I think we need to reckon with what it means to be part of a global society built on human sacrifices. Human sacrifice can very easily be used as an inflammatory rhetoric to talk about capitalism. And arguably, we don't need the rhetoric of human sacrifice to speak about capitalism and its evils. Certainly, the system itself is self-evidently so violent that we don't need to embellish it with this kind of hyperbole. But I think there's something quite useful in thinking through what it means to be living in a world of human sacrifices, because it also helps us explain the new political ecosystems we find ourselves in. If indeed we live in a world of human sacrifices, then we need to maybe reckon with the way that this is both understood and unseen at the same time by the vast majority of humans. We somehow know, all of us on some level, that this system is moving increasingly towards one where there will only be a small population privileged to live within increasingly militarized gated communities, while the vast majority of humanity is rendered surplus and sacrifice. And if that's the case, then the siren song of far-right and reactionary politicians to defend their people from the invasion of others, and from predation by others, and from conspiracies by others, becomes ever more appealing. I think there's something about realizing that capitalism has created a global system of human sacrifice that helps us understand and then hopefully confront the kind of politics that are emerging in our age. And of course, to try and articulate a different politics that must necessarily include the abolition of the capitalist system if we are to in fact survive, let alone thrive, as a species, and an interdependent species at that. To conclude, I just want to point towards this quite remarkable document that was just published last year by a number of scholars and activists and journalists and grassroots campaigners and human rights organizations, called the Just Transition in the Palm Oil Industry Report, a Preliminary Perspective, excuse me. I think this report is extremely promising. It comes from on-the-ground activists and people with decades and decades of experience. It presents a plan, a sketch of a plan, I should say, for the reclamation of lands and rights by palm oil sector workers themselves, and by affected communities, and by indigenous groups. And it plots a way forward to imagine a way of placing power back in their hands, taking it away from the sort of global agribusiness corporations and the palm oil industry in general. My work in my book is to simply tell a slightly different story, and to try and invite us to narrate ourselves and our role in this world differently. I think this report offers much more tangible pathways forward. The one thing I'll say about it is that it presents us with an incredible narrative about how people might reclaim their power within those communities, but it has grave implications and difficult implications for those of us in the global north who are palm oil consumers. If the advice in this report was followed, if the pathway was followed, then the price of palm oil would necessarily shoot up as less and less of it would be produced. Now, they make a very strong argument that that's perhaps not a bad thing, because it would force those of us elsewhere in the world to find new sources of edible and industrial oils. It would force us to relocalize production. It would force us to create a new metabolic relationship in all places between people and the earth. And that's not a bad thing. But it does mean that if we want to confront and overcome the palm oil industry as one of many industries that's doing incredibly destructive work on the planet, we need to also do a profound local work of transforming our communities to not be dependent on global supply chains and global commodities, but instead relocalize much of our production. And also then to imagine how our local communities could bind themselves together in new ways outside of the global capitalist economy and in some new kind of framework of global exchange and reciprocity. I'll stop there.
Well, Max, that was really great. Now I'm really dying to read the book from cover to cover. Uh, so let's just throw it open to anyone who has any comments or questions. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Max. That was a really interesting examination, not just of palm oil, but even more importantly, the ecological, political, economic, larger context. But I'm wondering, there's been quite a number of books in recent years looking at, usually you can call them, I guess, products. That's how they're talked about often. Um, could you speak a little bit about, those books, about did any of those influence your writing? How do you see what you've done as different? How are they adequate, inadequate to the task of looking at products within that larger system and so on?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's maybe two things going on. I should say, like, there's a few books that came out just last year as well on palm oil that are really excellent, that are in many ways better than mine. Um, there's one called Planet Palm, which is an account from a journalist, a food journalist, and she actually travels around the world and talks to people about the palm oil industry, and it's very, very good. And then Jonathan Robbins is an economic historian, and he's actually written the kind of authoritative global history of the oil palm and palm oil industry. I relied on his work extensively, and it's excellent. So that's the narrow question about palm oil books. I think then in the markets and in society, there's a number of books, and you're right, that have come out over the last few years that really focus on commodity histories. And I think they're of two kinds. There's a kind of very commercially successful sort of book, and its king is Mark Kurlansky, who's actually a kind of left-wing guy, interesting guy. He wrote a very famous sort of biography of cod and one of salt. He sort of writes these kind of very popular commodity histories, and I've learned a lot from those books. I think they're quite interesting. But it's a kind of commercial nonfiction that I think pulls its punches when it comes to politics and doesn't necessarily reveal so much about the underlying systems. And then I think there's another set of commodity histories that are coming more from scholars and from radicals. And we've seen, for instance, global histories of soy, of corn, of sugar, of cotton. And I think these are much more promising because they really try and explain how we came to our present moment through the development of certain commodities. I think the risk of this genre, of which I think my book is one example, is that it can lead us to a certain kind of like wish for kind of aha moments that like, oh, now we understand that if it hadn't been for palm oil, capitalism would have never emerged as it did. I think Jonathan Robbins in his history of palm oil is correct. If capitalism hadn't developed palm oil, it would have found alternatives. It's just that palm oil, for various reasons, was extremely cheap, or maybe more accurately, to borrow the language from Jason Moore and Raj Patel, it could be cheapened by cheapening land, cheapening life, cheapening labor, cheapening money. These practices, these kind of violent practices through which capitalism cheapens things. I think my book is in the line with a lot of those histories. I think its virtues are that it's very short compared to many. Sometimes you get these like massive tomes, like the one on the history of cotton, for instance, which is amazing, but very, very dense, written by a historian. I'm a cultural theorist rather than a historian, so my concerns are a little bit different. I also think that often those commodity histories, they miss some of the things that I'm interested in, which are the more tangential and kind of weird connections. So like this book at certain points about palm oil starts nattering on about weapons manufacturing, and it starts talking about the history of modern art at various moments. And I think a lot about the Marxist terminology of the metabolic rift, this idea that humans, like in more embedded sustainable societies, humans have a metabolic relationship with the earth. Human labor transforms the earth, and then humans are transformed by that labor, and then the earth transforms. There's this kind of reciprocal relationship that gets severed by capitalism, where the worker is just in the factory, alienated from the earth, using products that are derived from extraction. That metabolic rift has been broken, that kind of cycle of energy transference. And I think what I try and do in this book is show that energy cycle, as we can see it playing out in the palm oil story, is a little more complex and weird than often we would give it credit for. It's not just about labor and commodities. It's also about technology. It's also about representation. It's also about culture. It's also about storytelling. And so the final thing I'll say is that I think this book, as I think I mentioned at the beginning, for me was an exercise in challenging myself not to be a better anti-capitalist scholar or theorist, but trying to challenge myself to be a better anti-capitalist storyteller. Because I think there's a great value in us figuring out ways to narrate to ourselves and to others how the world came to be. Because if we can narrate that different, my sort of vain hope is that maybe we can sort of narrate to ourselves the next steps in a different way. It's not as satisfying as some other forms of scholarly activism, let's say, or intellectual activism, but it's something that I'm really kind of curious about and fixated on. And so that was a major sort of influence on the book too.
Fine. Further comments, questions for Max? Marion?
Well, I was totally ignorant about the presence of palm oil in so much food. And I'm just wondering, is there some way, I mean, I know your book kind of moves in this direction, but is there some way to enlighten people about it? I mean, I do a lot of reading, but palm oils have been completely off the charts for me, so I have a hunch it's true for a lot of other people. And I'm just wondering how can we alert people? Even the fact that ramen noodles is so full of palm oil and that it's so bad for you, you know? It's like, whoa, people eat it around here like it's an exotic Asian dish.
Yeah, well, it's I should say that ramen noodles, I mean, there's a war within capitalism between different oil industries. So the palm oil industry and the soybean industry hate each other. And so sometimes ramen noodles are made with soy oil, sometimes they're made with corn oil, sometimes they're made with, canola oil. But often, and especially in Asia, it's made with palm oil because it's just so incredibly cheap. I mean, the NGOs, I think, have done a very good job of this. There's if you search palm oil groceries at the Google image search, you'll come up with a dozen infographics that show you the range of products that palm oil is in. Good. So that information does exist. And those organizations have tried to get it out there. A book, if you want to give someone who's not going to read a book like mine a book, Zuckerman's Planet Palm book is great. I mean, she's a journalist who writes for major newspapers. She's very clear. It's a very nice book. I think part of the problem, though, is that palm oil is in major quantities in a lot of products, especially like soaps and detergents and that sort of thing, as well as processed foods. But it's also in trace amounts in a huge amount of other foods because it's used as an emulsifier or a surfactant, which is a kind of like a lubricant, or it's used. We derive a lot of food preservatives from it. So it's in a weird way, it's kind of in everything. And for me, the challenge is not so much to boycott it. I mean, there's a lot of palm oil boycott campaigns. I think most people who work on the ground with activists in Southeast Asia and Latin America don't have found that boycotts typically don't actually work very well. I mean, for one's personal reasons, for health reasons, one might seek to avoid it. But it does, I think the first temptation, because we've all been raised in a society of consumers, is to say, well, if I want to take action against palm oil, I should stop buying it. But I think part of the argument of my book and the argument of a lot of these organizations is that doesn't do the work we necessarily hope it would do.
Good, thanks. Apropos of what you just said, the Marxist Education Project group is reading a book on climate change and class warfare by Huber. I've forgotten. But he talks a lot about guilt, professional managerial class guilt, and how just giving up on palm oil is not the solution. So you overlap.
Yes, definitely. I think it's really important.
Hi, Max. I might have missed it, but had you mentioned the book Cod by Mark Kurlansky, I think? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
'Cause I read that book probably, I don't know, a long time ago, 10, 15 years ago. Um, and I thought it was the first. I'm not that big a nonfiction reader, but I thought the story that he told about cod and put these sort of um, pre-colonial and colonial connections in terms of the triangulation between the British Islands, Nova Scotia, and the Caribbean was pretty interesting. And I thought, I personally would like to see more books that were like that. And I went, do you think of your book as sort of fitting into that? I mean, if you want to say genre or that way of understanding this sort of under researched and history of the world, essentially, of how food becomes part of, or products like this becomes part of this sort of real shift in history. Of course, cod is like, I guess, overfished now, so that's become another issue. And I don't know that palm oil is necessarily, other than if there are successful boycotts, that the industry of harvesting palm oil is going away necessarily.
No, it's definitely not. And I should mention that the palm oil industry makes a number of arguments that are very hard to dismiss. I mean, one of them is that compared to other oil-producing plants, oil palms, at least theoretically, sequester more carbon. The problem is that people are chopping down massive swaths of rainforest and peatlands to grow them. So it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, essentially. And on the balance, the carbon emissions are much worse. But the other thing that they often point out is that, per acre, oil palm is one of the most productive plants in the world in terms of the agricultural outputs for every, square meter under cultivation, which is hard to deny. And, the industry will always say, and you can look this up anytime, they have a ton of propaganda about it, that, we have a growing global population that needs fats. It's a big, important part of the human diet. Where else are you going to get them? And they rightly point out that, if we were to try and get all of those fats from, let's say, healthier vegetable oils, we would have to dedicate a great deal of land to it. What gets eliminated from that perspective, though, is a relocalization of production and, the undoing of the kind of division of labor where you have some humans growing all the other humans' food. We need some different relationship to the earth and our food systems that's much more intimate and involved from each of us. That's a big transition, though, and it's not going to solve all of our problems either. I mean, we can't just feed everyone through community gardens, but it would be great to have more. Okay, so back to your question. Yeah, I do see my book as part of that. I think that there's a real value in telling those stories because they're our stories, ultimately. Like, again, I go back to that metaphor of metabolism. It's not even a metaphor. It's quite literally the metabolism, the way in which we reproduce our bodies biologically is through the food we consume, and the food we consume arrives to us through systems. So it's a really intimate way of getting to know the systems that dominate our world. For me, the most important system in there is capitalism and its entanglements with systems of sort of organized patriarchy and settler colonialism and empire. So I definitely see my work in that tradition. I certainly see my work in like working towards the same organization of human attention, by which is my way of maybe saying markets. Like, people like commodity history. They're interested in it. They buy books about commodities. And so I think it's valuable for people with a critical perspective to enter into that space and try and complicate it in certain ways. Because then I think my book also participates in another tradition, which is what I like to call the Marxist hologram of the commodity. Like a hologram, if you have a hologram like on glass and you break it, every single shard of the hologram will have a complete version of the picture on it. I think a lot about holograms because my partner is an artist who runs a very large mutual aid project called The Hologram. So we talk about holograms a lot. And I actually think it's a really wonderful way of thinking about Marx's idea of the commodity, because, Marx begins Capital Volume 1 by focusing on the commodity, which at first just appears to be a thing. But then as he looks at it, and I think that, both Harry Cleaver and David Harvey have made this point, when you really look at those first chapters of Capital, Marx kind of shows us that you can see the whole world through any commodity. That if you trace the commodity back, you begin to see the whole world that had to be created in order to produce that thing, and not only to produce it, but to bring it to market as this alienated commodity. So I actually think you can write a fairly compelling story about anything under capitalism, because each commodity is a fragment of capital, like a holographic fragment, where if you know how to look, you can see the whole in the part. And I think there's a long tradition of doing that that begins with Marx, but that has seen many people do really interesting projects up to the current day. I don't think that's what most commodity histories are doing. Most commodity histories are sort of trying to educate us about the history of the world, but maybe not trying to allow us to see the system. And my attempt, and the attempt of many others, I think, is to give us a glimpse of that system in the holographic fragment.
Yeah, well, I agree. I don't remember whereas I found that book, Cod, very interesting, and I would recommend it to anybody. I don't remember it being, particularly anti-capitalist in its analysis, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
It's more about
he's a
this
great
alternative
storyteller.
histories,
I will say Kurlansky is an incredible nonfiction writer. He really knows how to take information and turn it into a story that lots of people want to read. So I envy his skills, but I don't think that's his main concern. Yeah.
Right. But I do think it's interesting that what you just said, that any story about a commodity, in that case, could be written in terms of a Marxist theoretical analysis or perspective. Mind you, I'm not a Marxist, although I was married to one at one point. So.
Condolences.
Max, I was just going to mention that. Ariana has her hand up. I'll wait. Go ahead, Ariana.
Yeah, sorry, I have my camera off because I have a temperature and bad cold. Thanks so much. It was an amazing talk and amazing discussion afterwards. So I really love all of it, and the commodity history that you weave is just so much food for thought from different perspectives. So when just from the start, what a question I had in your great example of the ad, the Greenpeace ad, it was just wonderful because it brought to mind your analysis of it was really wonderful because it brought to mind discussion we have with environmental groups I'm part of, where in relation to Extinction Rebellion, for example, where many of the stunts they put on are non-violent direct action, and that's what they and their activism, but actually their targets are a lot consumers, and so the idea is to change the consumer. So and also Animal Rebellion, which is a connected group, maybe does that even more because their main point is they are not going to stop salmon farming, but they are going to put on stunts that are supposed to discourage people from engaging in that form of consumption. And there is so one question I had was, how do we draw on these commodity histories like your book to have these conversations, and what kind of so how can it's just a question about how can we draw on a book like yours to start these conversations. And the second, which is a kind of I was wondering about anti-speciesist commodity histories. Whether just out of curiosity, whether there are commodity histories, for example, of palm oil, that come to it from a non-anthropocentric perspective in a way, and that again comes out of discussions within activist groups, whereby the history around climate change, how do we move that away from an anthropocentric perspective on climate change as what we start with in trying actually to make to take a stand and create a movement against that, just because people are worried about their future of the future human generations. So how do we so that's a second level of discussion within many environmental between environmental activists. And so I was wondering again, how do we how can we use the lens of commodity histories, for example, but reframing those from an anthropocentric perspective, where what we are concerned with is non-human and more than human words. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. I'll start with the second one first. There's a really fascinating scholar named Sophie Chow who has been doing kind of multi-species ethnography on palm oil, where I think she's really trying to move us away from the anthropocentric perspective, and really asking, like, how does this plant interact with a whole variety of different species in a whole variety of different ways, while still, of course, keeping in focus the incredible ecological destruction and biodiversity destruction that in human hands and through human manipulation the plant is being forced to enact. So I think her work is the work that I've seen that I think is the most promising in terms of breaking us out of that particular worldview. I don't think my book does that very much at all, which is one of the absences in the book, but it's also a very short book and from a very particular perspective. But I think it's a really important perspective to take. You know, I feel like in human hands, the oil palm has become a devastating ecocidal weapon, which is really too bad because, you know, for millennia in West Africa, it was an important part of a biodiverse ecosystem that had many, many different roles and could be grown and harvested very sustainably in ways that gave a lot to humans and also gave a lot to other forms of life as well. So it's really palm oil in the kind of plantation scene, to use that terminology, that this sort of botanical actor becomes so incredibly violent. I mean, in a funny way, like I've heard it said by some palm oil scholars that like the oil palm is one of the most successful plants in the world. I mean, it's doing great. It's basically gone from being a kind of strange regional curiosity, this strange fruit-producing tree that can manifest a huge amount of oil, which is very rare to begin with, that you could derive so much oil from a fruit, to now being essentially one of the most abundant, one of the single most abundant life forms on the planet. You know, and almost all of those life forms are of the same cultivar of the oil palm as well. So in a weird way, like it's like we've helped it take over the planet. But then I mean we get into strange questions about what the oil palm wants. And you know, I would prefer to imagine that it, like most species, it actually wants biodiversity and wants to be entangled in complex ways with multiple forms of life, rather than being the kind of pet of a species that's actively trying to destroy itself. So yeah, that's a long answer to that question. I think your question about Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion and these forms of activism is really good. And I don't know if I have a great answer. I think you're totally right that like these groups, they have in mind narrative that I think a lot of activist groups have, which is that if you can raise awareness, change will happen. And I think it's a flawed premise. I think there's lots of examples throughout modern history of times when people have been able to raise awareness and no change is coming from that new awareness. I mean, probably most famously, it comes down to debates that were happening in the civil rights movement between Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King and others that Kwame Ture finally eventually said the problem with Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement that he was leading is that their whole strategy is making white society aware of Black suffering. But what if they don't care? So we need to have some other different kind of strategy. I think it's that conflict plays out again and again and again. And I think on the bright side, I mean, in a liberal capitalist society where all of us have been schooled in liberal capitalist values, we have been taught to believe that if people get education and information, they will do the right thing. And I think that's a deeply flawed presumption, but it is what allows so many people to join XR and their affiliate groups. Because if you're young and you want to do something about the climate crisis, it naturally makes sense to you if you've been schooled in that worldview that going out and raising awareness is the thing to do. And it helps that they're going out and raising awareness in a way that's combative and confrontational and exciting. But I think, and it's a friendly critique, their strategy, it's all tactics and no strategy, or it's mostly tactics and the strategy is somewhat flawed because it presumes that once you undertake the tactic, which is these kind of quite gutsy forms of disruption, that's necessarily going to lead to awareness, and awareness is going to lead to action, and that action will be good. But there's a number of junctures there that I think are flawed. I mean, one of them is I think maybe the problem isn't awareness. I think everyone kind of knows and is filled with a certain kind of existential dread about the problems that humanity faces due to the climate crisis. Some people are in denial. Some people are responding with reactionary backlash. But I think awareness isn't exactly the problem. And then the idea that awareness would lead to action, I think often awareness leads to inaction. And we're yet to fully understand the conditions under which awareness leads to action. And then finally, the presumption that action will necessarily be good, I think, is a dangerous one. I think actually the action that awareness might lead to could be very bad. And I would actually point to a lot of the reactionary formations and fascist formations around the world as very bad reactions and actions that stem from a certain awareness of the crisis. So I guess I feel like a book like mine maybe doesn't have anything very directly to offer to those movements other than maybe information, but I hope that it would also give people some language to move beyond the kind of consumer/education driven idea about, and then maybe could prompt some critical questions that would lead to a bit of a different strategy. Without at the same time, just discouraging people or, having the headline like smug professor shakes his fist at children, or shakes his fist at young angry people, because I don't want to do that either. I would rather sort of have a conversation that is about actually how do these things sort of play out in a strategic sense.
So just as a sort of an aside, but kind of interesting, I saw the new film, The Woman King, last week, which is it's kind of a Afrocentric revenge fantasy about slavery in West Africa, and the protagonist is advising the king of a West African kingdom and saying, we could we could dispense with this trading in human lives if we would just start growing oil palm.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's a whole
Wow.
proposal as the alternative to the slave trade is to bring in, and I just thought how ironic that was when you tell your story of the supplanting of the slave trade by the oil palm industry in the later 19th century. And I don't know if the writers of the film were aware of that history or not, but
I suspect
they
they
certainly
are.
nailed it there.
I mean, Walter Rodney wrote about it quite extensively and how Europe underdeveloped Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So that story, the story is known. I'd be curious to see the film because there were attempts by Africans to retake the palm oil industry in the 19th century and early 20th century. And attempts by Africans to also sort of break the European control on the export of palm oil, or conversely, the importation of palm oil to Europe. And there's a bunch of really interesting stories about that, and then also a bunch of interesting and quite horrifying stories about how Europeans used sort of gunboat diplomacy and skullduggery to undermine Africans' attempts to take control over that industry as well. So that sounds very like there's a very big historical connection there. And, arguably, had there been a sort of enlightened African kingdom that wished to do so, I mean, the palm oil industry before Europeans arrived was not great. I mean, West African kingdoms were highly stratified and highly exploitative. Slavery, but not in the form of chattel slavery, predated European arrival in many of those kingdoms. So it's not to say that like things were fantastic before the arrival of the European palm markets. But I think the history indicates that over the span of the 19th century and into the 20th century, though that industry became much, much more exploitative. And even if beforehand there had been an African elite that had sustained itself on the exploitation of other African people, that elite got smaller and smaller and smaller and more dependent on European relationships. And the conditions of palm oil growing became more and more exploitative and industrialized and dangerous.
Okay, any more thoughts, comments, questions for Max or in general?
I just want to say it was a terrific presentation and I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think we all did. And again, we're going to put this on YouTube in a few days and tell all your friends what they missed. And,
Yeah.
drive
Buy
some
the
more
book,
traffic to the Marxist Education Project.
Yes.
And Max. Max, thanks very much. We will look forward to seeing you again sometime. Keep writing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a pleasure.